Good evening, one and all. Welcome to this wonderful opening at the Chapel Gallery. Welcome to St. Matthias Anglican Church. My name is the Reverend Matt Humphrey. It's a privilege to be here with you all, to be at this church, and to welcome you to this. As we gather, I want to always acknowledge we do so on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We're grateful to be in this place for this land and for this beautiful building that we can gather in, and the wonderful ministry of the Chapel Gallery. So I just want to extend a warm welcome to this space for you to enjoy this time listening to our wonderful artists, hearing more about the work. And I'm going to turn it over to Vicki to say a bit more about that.
Hi, good evening. So wonderful to see everybody. My name is Nikki Rendell, and I'm one of the curators here. And it is a great pleasure to be able to introduce you to Georgina Montgomery, who I think probably most of you know. And it is such a pleasure to show her very unique and quite extraordinary photographic work here tonight. So just a little bit of a spiel about Georgina now. Georgina, as many of you know, is a woman of many artistic talents, who prior to devoting her time to the visual arts was involved in the language arts as a professional writer and editor. She's a communicator of ideas, and her love of language arts clearly informs her visual art practice. This exhibition, titled Room for Not Knowing, features unique photography-based work that blurs the lines between painting and photography. Georgina's images explore the concepts of time, unpredictability, uncertainty, chance, and the acceptance of not knowing. Georgina has previously worked with a variety of paint mediums, including encaustics, mixed media, and hot glass. In this exhibition, she explores painting photographically with reflected light. She paints with crazed light, capturing the reflection of ordinary moments in time, and turns those banal moments into alchemy, resulting in her images reflecting a past, a present, and a future, all to be interpreted and explored by the viewer. Each piece takes us into another reflected moment in time and invites us to ponder on what chance light being created these amorphous worlds. What dust particle, blown by the wind and caught in the light, created a certain refraction and subtly altered the image. So much is left to chance. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Georgina.
Thank you so much, Matt and Nikki, for the introductions, and thank you so much for making the time to be here tonight in your busy lives. When I was about 20, I read Lewis Thomas's Lives of a Cell, which some of you may know as well. And the quote that really stood out for me, or one that has stuck with me, was, statistically, the probability of any one of us being here is so small, you'd think the mere fact of existing would keep us in a constant dazzlement of surprise. So it really spoke to me, and I think that even at the age of 20, probably because I was 20, I thought to myself, that's a pretty tall order, trying to maintain a state of constant dazzlement and dealing with the world of despair and disappointment and uncertainty and unpredictability. But still, I could buy into that idea of chance, and not only the chance that we're all here, that we were all born and we arrived here, but that chanciness of everyday life and what we learn to work with and how we roll with that and the ups and downs of life. And it was later that I began in my art process, I stumbled on really a way of what I think of as harnessing unpredictability in order to see what I could find in that disruption. And I discovered that really some marvels, I call them, kept emerging, and that I always found reassuring. And so there was this sort of way of, I guess, in a sense, trying to use as a metaphor this idea of unpredictable light and how I could apply that, not that I applied it to everyday living, but thinking of that as a parallel. And so it's to what I think of as light and chance that I owe both the process I'll be talking about, very simple process, and also the show tonight, this collection of works, speaks to that as well. So, without further ado, the beginning of the process, I began really primarily, as Nikki has said, working in paint and mixed media, collage. And one day I had a vase on my windowsill, kitchen windowsill, and I was just taken by the color and distorted imagery in it, and I started just taking a couple of photos with my phone, and not really thinking of using it in any other way except that it might give me some ideas for painting and coming up with new ideas for painting abstractly. And pretty soon I was so taken with this vase that I would, every time I went into the kitchen, I would take some images with it. But I wasn't doing very much more with it than that. And this is what I would call my early stage. I was just taking what was there. There's perhaps not visible on this screen. These colors aren't quite true, but there's part of the screen window in there behind, and that I was taken with, at different times of the day and try to get some light. And then 2 years intervened. The vase got put away. We moved a couple of times. I returned to painting, and it wasn't until I think it was 2019 that I had the opportunity through a mentorship group I was in to really focus on something. And I decided at that point I'd resurrect the vase rather than trying to be painting or doing any of these other things. I would just see if there was more I could get out of this process. So I really dedicated myself to it and decided I would give myself some time to do more with it and really, as I thought of it, sort of push the light and push the vase. So then I began experimenting with moving the vase around the house, moving it into the yard, taking it on road trips, doing a lot of cropping, placing it in different parts of the house at different times of day, at different angles. Sometimes I magnified, I zoom in. This particular image, for example, is one that I caught, so I couldn't see this light with my naked eye, but it was a color sunshine reflected off our red couch onto a beige wall, and I just couldn't get over how, and I'm not sure that it's showing up as particularly, it's a very orangey, fleshy, rich color. So it was that kind of surprise and dazzlement that really made my heart beat faster. I also began to work with more cropping, trying to get areas of greater contrast, trying to look for sharper lines, and of course composition as well. So I began to feel like I was, this expression of painting with crazed light. Clearly I wasn't really painting, but I found I could almost emulate, some, whether it was working with charcoal or working with ink or working with paint, and that really appealed to my sense of this project. Then in about, this is sort of a further, as I got along, then I was actually looking for more compositions, and again, it's very rare that any image I would take, I would use in its entirety, so it's always a lot of cropping or turning over. 95% of what I take I would delete. Then I would go through a sort of process of the 5% I didn't delete, I would take off to get printed just on inexpensive photo paper. And then if I still felt I had something, that's when I'd advance to the getting the work printed on fine art paper. But at this time, as I say, when I began to think of this as, painting with crazed light, a physicist told me, this physicist is my husband, told me that this isn't crazed light, these are caustic optics. So caustics essentially refers to any light that passes through a medium such as water or air or glass and gets highly reflected and refracted, and it lands on the, looking at him right now, he's in the back, it lands on the caustic plane of your eye, so it resolves at some point. So that's what I was seeing. So I was using this unusual lens train of, the camera, the light coming through, being all reflected and refracted through this glass, and then, to my own eye. So in that year, so I was thinking caustic optics, but then we got into 2020, and of course, everybody was talking about holding on to cautious optimism. And so then I thought, okay, this project, I'm going to call it caustic optimism. So in other words, trying to find some positivity and hope out of this pandemic and, out of the situation we're in, out of this disruption. So that's when I called the whole project in my mind caustic optimism. Now here's an example, very simple. I mean, it is an incredibly simple process. So I just have two examples here. One shows some lattice work without my vase, without my worked glass, and on the right is the image that I would look for. So it's not that, I would just set the vase on a table and take a snapshot. It doesn't quite work like that, but it's what if I could pull something out of it, that would be what it is. Here's another example that was the day the arborist arrived, and we got, well, he was busy working in the back, I was working the vase in the front, just on my studio table, and came up with this image. So that's pretty simple, and you can all go home tonight and find a vase. Or any piece of worked glass. I will say, one of the other things I've experimented with was actually using a different camera. So early in the process, I thought, I have a Pentax SLR, digital camera with lenses, and it was not successful at all. I couldn't be nimble, it was too cumbersome, couldn't adjust the focus, even on automatic, so it was too powerful for what I was trying to do. And I also have tried different vases, different pieces of glass, and there's just something about this particular vase that gives me the right amount of distortion without making it look completely like a kaleidoscope, or, I wasn't looking for sort of funhouse mirrors or complete breakdown. Or I worked on singles for a long time, and then just because I had so many of these test prints around, I started pairing some of them, which was quite accidental. I just had a large piece of, like a frame, like mat board, and so one day in my studio I just put two images together, and then I thought, oh, it's like, when you put two pieces of anything together intentionally, you get an interesting juxtaposition. So then I was unleashed for a while, and I was pairing everything, and some not necessarily equally half and half, but trying to, just play to the image. And then I experimented a little with pairing a photo image with one of my paintings on paper. So did that for a while. And then that evolved, I'm happy to say, into, that looks like text box has gone across the image, but I collaborated with another Victoria artist last fall, Louise Oborn, who's here tonight, pairing my photo images with her mixed media works. So that was, yeah, again, just interesting to work together to see how that would come together. And then I started pairing pairs, and it led to suddenly my thinking, oh, these are like building blocks. So then I created a couple of what I think of as text blocks. So really, I was thinking of them as visual translations of passages of text. This particular piece, I was in a group show with 4 other artists last August, and this was in that show, and it's called This Sweet Interlude. And so I took a paragraph, there's a writer, she's a scientist, philosopher, poet, and I really love her writings, the way she synthesizes thoughts about, time, and so this is a paragraph of hers, and it in finished form is about so the fully installed piece is about 4.5 by 6 feet. So each individual piece is 9.5 by 17, mounted on foam core. So it's not one big piece. And here's a detail from that work as well. And then I just continued sort of through much of last year, starting to think about, could I get these enlarged? They're clearly very low resolution images, and I know that it's the nature of the process. And even the first time I sent them for professional printing, I had a call from the printer saying it seemed as if I had made a mistake by sending the wrong files and so low resolution. So I persevered, and they did print them, and I actually like the fact, once they get printed, they do have a graininess to them that for me is part of what I'm after. So I started doing, I guess I was experimenting more with abstraction, but also then trying to, I think, still marry some of these images to, I shouldn't say marry them, I guess I'd be inspired by something I read, and so then I would be trying to create an image to reflect that. I also started, so I don't use Photoshop, I don't own Photoshop. I have resisted even thinking that maybe if I started using Photoshop, I would get, it would take me to another level, but I started thinking I would be spending all my time at my desk, which isn't really what I wanted to be doing. But I do use the editing that's available just with iPhones, So I will mention cropping, that's an obvious one. I started wanting to get some more black and white, which is difficult to do in normal conditions. We've got all sorts of light around us. So I have used filters occasionally if I want to just, not strip color out, but just turn it into a black and white image and aim for some contrast. So the left side of this is a sample of that. I also started experimenting with what I call montages, so just taking several pieces and building them into sort of a full story, if you like, or a bigger image, a more layered image. There's one in the show tonight, and then this is another sample of one. And again, I don't sew these together, using a software of any kind. I mean, I'm just re-photographing them, which I know, because I've heard it from a physicist, that it just starts, you're breaking down more and more the quality of your image, but that's what I'm doing for the moment. And then finally, and partly with this show in mind, I started about 11 months ago, just had this idea of weaving, because of course these images are all split seconds of time. I began to think, if I actually cut an image up into strips, or several images, but even if I took the same image, would that be, and I wove them, would that be like creating time? Could I be buying back some time by, putting 60 seconds together and creating a minute? Could I do that? So I began playing just with that idea, and I loved this work to be weaving. It's such a perfect symbol, I guess, of trying to create order. And again, this sort of comes back to this idea of chanciness and all the disruption and disorder that we deal with on a regular basis. And of course, the implications, you can create safety nets and all sorts of things you can run with once you weave. The other thing I liked about in the process of experimenting with weaving was thinking about the idea of memory, because here's an image. On this day I take a shot, and then 3 weeks later I take this shot, and if I put them together, is that like weaving 2 times together to create one memory? And we all know how our mind, memory is, as we know, imperfect, and it's not always linear, and that we zoom in and zoom out, and some details we can remember, crystal clear, and others we completely forget. And so in an image like this, I began to think of those spaces, almost like pixelation. I sort of thought, maybe that's the way our mind works. It's in these little bites and where some of the spaces are larger and empty, well, maybe that's just the way that's the way it works, how we remember some things. And then I paired some weaving pieces with some single pieces, and this one, for example, makes me think that it's just saying what we forget is as significant as what we remember. So that was what I had in mind when I pulled this piece together. And finally, that brings me to how light and chance has played a role in this show tonight, and this theme and this thought. Room for Not Knowing. Maybe some of you are familiar with the writings of American Buddhist Pema Chodron. I must admit, I have never read any of her books, but I really admire pieces I have read by her. And this, to me, just speaks again of, there's a bit of the quoting here, but just to this idea of us, there's so much we cannot control. And there's so much that we just don't know how things will turn out, and so often we just have to, I guess, ease into whatever is going on and work with that, or just give over to that, I suppose, in terms of a sense of surrender. And so tonight, this show, I would just say, is all the pieces in it are really works that I think it was almost like a call and response once I had this idea in mind and the process in mind and how they came together, is my response to what it might mean. And so that's pulled. There's some singles, as you've seen, there's some weaving, and so just that idea that we just have to give ourselves over to not knowing everything and leaving it at that. So thank you again very much for coming. Really appreciate you being here and your interest, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Or we can all just go to the gallery again.
Yeah, right. So one of the quotes in one of the pieces is pretty time. It's along the lines of, I yearn for the time when I do everything.
Oh, yes.
And so I was wondering when that was.
About 20, when I was about 20. We're all about 20, we know. But yes, thanks, John, for that. Yes, that's from a poet friend of mine in Victoria. That's from one of her poems. And yes, I pined for the time when I knew everything. So, yeah. And then it was all downhill after 20. Anyway, Thank you very much again. I really appreciate it.